You know what, old-timer? Why don't you sit this one out before you embarrass yourself in front of all these people? Those were the words spoken by a 32-year-old competitive shooter to a 78-year-old man wearing a faded Marine Corps cap standing patiently in line at a precision rifle expo deep in West Texas. The old man had paid his entry fee in crumpled $20 bills. His rifle was borrowed. His hands trembled slightly as he held the paperwork against the registration table. 63 shooters before him had already tried and failed to ring a 12-inch steel plate at 1,000 yards using iron sights only, and the prize, $10,000 in cash, sat in a clear acrylic case on the judge's table, taunting every one of them. The old man didn't argue back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even seem to hear the insult. He just smiled politely, signed his name on the clipboard with a steady cursive hand, and walked to the firing line. If you believe respect should never be measured by a man's age or the wear on his boots, type respect in the comments before this video is over. Because what happened in the next 3 minutes on that West Texas range is the kind of moment that makes grown men go silent and grown women cry. His name was Earl Whitlo, and on most days of the year you'd find him in a small workshop behind his daughter's house in Lubbock, Texas, repairing antique clocks for $40 apiece. He drove a 1994 Ford pickup truck with a cracked windshield held together by clear packing tape. He drank black coffee from the same tin thermos he'd carried since 1968, dented along one side from a fall he didn't like to talk about. His clothes were neat but worn, a flannel shirt buttoned almost to the throat, work pants creased that morning by an iron, boots polished but scuffed at the toes. The dog tags he wore around his neck he always kept tucked carefully beneath his shirt, never on display. He hadn't come to the Precision Rifle Expo to win the prize, though heaven knows he needed the money after his wife's medical bills. He'd come because his late wife Margaret, on the last day of her life in a hospice room 3 years earlier, had made him promise that he wouldn't let what he'd been given just die quietly with him in some workshop. He didn't fully understand back then what she'd meant by that. But every year since, when his old battalion association mailed him a flyer for some shooting competition somewhere in the country, he'd pack a small duffel bag and quietly go. The expo took place across 2 days in a sprawling dusty field outside Midland, Texas, where the wind comes off the plains in long, unpredictable gusts. Vendors lined the perimeter selling optics, ammunition, and tactical gear that cost more money than Earl's truck. The shooters that weekend were mostly young men in their 20s and 30s, decked out in matching team shirts with sponsor patches stitched on the sleeves, drinking energy drinks from cans, comparing the latest custom rifle builds chambered in calibers that didn't even exist when Earl was in uniform. Iron sights in their world were considered a relic, a novelty, a kind of punishment. That's exactly why the prize money had been set so high. The event organizer, a slick businessman named Cole Bannister, had designed it as a marketing stunt to draw a bigger crowd. He didn't actually expect anyone to make the shot. The challenge was theatrical. The plate sat 10 football fields away, barely visible to the naked eye, shimmering in the rising heat. To hit it with iron sights, a shooter needed perfect technique, perfect breathing, perfect wind reading, and a kind of stillness that most modern shooters had simply never learned how to find. By the second day of competition, 63 competitors had tried. 63 had failed. When Earl finally approached the registration table that afternoon, the young woman behind the laptop barely glanced up at him. She slid the entry form across the table without making eye contact. "Sir, you do understand this is iron sights only, right? No scopes. Most folks competing here have been shooting precision rifles for years." Earl nodded once. "I understand, ma'am. Thank you." Behind him in line, 2 competitors snickered audibly. One of them, the same 32-year-old who had told him to sit it out a few minutes earlier, leaned over to his friend and said, loud enough for Earl to hear without question, $10 says the old man can't even see the plate from the bench." His friend laughed openly. The young woman finally looked up properly from her screen. She saw the faded cap, the worn flannel, the trembling hands holding a borrowed rifle that was easily 40 years older than she was. She hesitated. "Sir, are you really sure you want to try this? The recoil on that rifle, at your age?" Earl smiled at her gently, the way a man smiles at a granddaughter who's worried for no reason. "I've handled it before, ma'am, long time ago, but the hands remember what the mind forgets." She nodded slowly and slid him a paper number. 64. A small crowd had begun to gather along the firing line by the time Earl carried his rifle case down the gravel path. Word had spread quickly that an old man in a marine cap was about to try the shot. Some came out of pity, the way people gather around a stray dog. Some watched the way people watch a slow-motion car wreck, half wanting the disaster to happen so they'd have a story to tell at dinner. A few children had climbed onto coolers and truck beds for a better view down the line. The range officer, a former army sergeant named Doug Henley with a grey-streaked beard and 28 years of service behind him, met Earl at the shooting bench and shook his hand firmly. "Sir, you've got 3 minutes total to settle in. Take your shot and clear the line. You get one single round. The plate is 12 inches across, painted bright white. Current wind is 5 miles per hour, coming in from the south-southwest, gusting maybe to 7. Range is confirmed at exactly 1,000 yards. Earl nodded once and said nothing. He set the borrowed rifle down carefully on the bench, an old Remington 700 chambered in .308, the kind of rifle he hadn't touched in nearly 20 years. He took off his faded cap, set it gently on the bench beside him, and folded the brim twice so that the eagle, globe, and anchor faced upward toward the sky. Then he sat down on the bench, closed his eyes, and breathed in slowly through his nose. For the first full 60 seconds he didn't move at all. Some people in the crowd thought he'd fallen asleep at the bench. The 32-year-old who'd mocked him crossed his arms and shook his head theatrically. "This is honestly painful to watch," he muttered to his friend, just loud enough. But the range officer, Doug Henley, was watching Earl very differently now. He'd seen this before, long ago, in a different country, in a different life entirely. Men who closed their eyes before a shot. Men who didn't rush, didn't fidget, didn't adjust and readjust their grip. Men who let their pulse drop until you couldn't see their chest rise or fall. He'd seen it exactly twice in his entire career, and both times the shooter had been a Marine Corps scout sniper. Doug's eyes narrowed slightly. He looked back at Earl. Really looked. The old man's hand was no longer trembling at all. After about 90 seconds had passed, Earl opened his eyes slowly, the way the sun rises over a desert horizon. He chambered the round with a smooth, practiced motion that didn't quite match the lines on his face. He brought the rifle stock up to his shoulder. He didn't adjust his sights more than a quarter turn. He exhaled, long and steady, and waited at the bottom of the breath. Then, in the middle of that stillness, a single clean crack split the West Texas afternoon wide open. For 1 full second after the shot, absolutely nothing happened. The crowd held its collective breath. Then, from 1,000 yards away across the dusty field, the unmistakable sound of steel ringing came rolling back to them, sharp and clear and undeniable. The plate had been struck almost dead center. The spotters confirmed it immediately on the radio, their voices cracking with disbelief. Cole Bannister, the event organizer, dropped the clipboard he'd been holding. The young woman from the registration table covered her mouth with both hands. The 32-year-old who'd mocked Earl simply stood frozen on the gravel path, the smirk wiped clean off his face like chalk from a board. There was a long, surreal pause, longer than seemed possible, and then someone deep in the crowd let out a whoop, and applause broke out like a thunderclap rolling across the field. Earl himself didn't react to any of it. He didn't smile. He didn't turn to acknowledge the cheers. He simply put the rifle down on the bench, picked up his folded cap and stood up slowly. His hand was trembling again now, but not from age this time. Doug Henley walked up to him with careful steps, his weathered face pale. "Sir," he said quietly, low enough that only Earl could hear him over the noise. "Where did you serve, brother?" Earl looked at him for a long moment. "Vietnam," he said softly. "Long time ago now." Doug Henley's eyes filled instantly. "What unit, sir?" Before Earl could answer, a black SUV pulled into the gravel lot at the edge of the range. It moved with the kind of unhurried purpose that draws attention without trying. It parked at the edge of the firing line, the engine still running, and a tall man in a charcoal suit stepped out into the dust. He was in his late 60s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of straight-backed posture you simply don't lose even after 30 years out of uniform. He walked directly toward Earl, ignoring every other person on the property. The crowd parted in front of him without even realizing they were doing it. Cole Bannister recognized the man immediately and rushed forward. It was retired Major General Henry Marsh, the current chairman of one of the largest defense contractors in the country, and the man who had quietly sponsored more than half the prize money for the entire expo. "General Marsh, sir, we weren't expecting you to attend in person. We'd have arranged..." Marsh held up one hand without ever looking in his direction. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Earl Whitlo, and then slowly and very deliberately, he raised his right hand to his brow and rendered a salute. The crowd went absolutely silent in an instant. "Gunnery Sergeant Whitlo," Marsh said, his voice thick and unsteady. "It has been 46 years, sir, and I owe you my life, every day of it." Earl returned the salute, slow and exact. His hand was completely steady now, the way it had been on the rifle. General Marsh turned to face the crowd, and what he said next, no one standing in that dusty Texas field would ever forget for the rest of their lives. "In 1972, he began, his voice carrying, "this man, this quiet man right here, was a scout sniper attached to a recon platoon working north of Da Nang. He was attached to my platoon. We were pinned down in an ambush at the bottom of a hillside, 3 of us already wounded, the rest of us out of options and out of ammunition. Gunnery Sergeant Whitlo was 3/4 of a mile away on the opposite ridge, looking through iron sights because his rifle scope had been shattered by shrapnel the day before. He made a shot that morning, ladies and gentlemen, that no one in our chain of command believed was actually possible until the recovery team confirmed it the next week. He took out the enemy machine gunner who had us pinned down in the open, and then he kept that gunner's 2 replacements down for the better part of an hour while my men dragged the wounded back to the tree line. 2 more shots, at distances I am not going to repeat out loud right now because you would not believe me if I told you." Marsh paused and let his eyes travel across the crowd. He holds the Silver Star, he holds the Navy Cross, and he has never told a single one of you any of this, has he? He never would have. Cole Bannister couldn't speak. The 32-year-old who'd mocked Earl earlier was staring fixedly at the ground, his face the colour of old paper. The cheque was written and signed that same afternoon, under the open sky. Earl folded it once carefully, slid it into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, and shook Cole Bannister's hand without any sign of triumph. He didn't make a speech. He didn't pose for photographs. He thanked the range officer Doug Henley by name, picked up his rifle case, and walked back to his old Ford pickup truck with General Marsh walking quietly beside him. The 2 men spoke alone in the parking lot for nearly an hour as the sun lowered toward the West Texas horizon. No one in the crowd disturbed them, no one even approached. When Earl finally started his engine and drove away, the crowd lined the gravel road on both sides without anyone telling them to, and they watched his battered truck disappear into the dusk. The 32-year-old who'd mocked him had quietly vanished somewhere into the parted crowd long before. The young woman from the registration table was crying softly into a tissue near the judge's tent. Cole Bannister, the man who'd designed the entire event as a marketing stunt and nothing more, sat alone on a folding chair for a long time after dark, just staring out at the steel plate 1,000 yards away across the empty field. The very next year, the Precision Rifle Expo was renamed the Whitlo Invitational, and an Iron Sights division was added to honour him. Earl used the prize money to pay off his daughter's mortgage and to fund a small memorial bench near his old base in California, dedicated to the men from his platoon who never came home. He still repairs antique clocks in Lubbock for $40 apiece. He still drinks black coffee from the same dented tin thermos he's carried since 1968. He still wears his cap with the eagle, globe, and anchor pressed close beneath his flannel shirt, right against his heart. Because real legends don't announce themselves to the room when they walk in. They simply do what is asked of them, and then they walk quietly home in the dust. If this story moved you the way it moved me, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who needs reminding that respect is earned in silence, not demanded in noise, and that the quietest man in any room is very often the one who has done the most for the rest of us. Type Semper Fi in the comments to honour Gunnery Sergeant Earl Whitlo and every veteran like him, walking among us right now, unseen, unheard, and never asking for a single thing in return.